I rise tonight to speak on this appropriations bill, and in doing so take the opportunity to talk again about this government's budget. Budgets, as we know, are incredibly important documents. But in a recession, in this recession particularly, this budget could not be more important. But it's not just what's written down on paper that matters. In a recession like this, it's important what governments do, because governments have a job to do during recessions, to lead the country in an economic plan, to drive investment, to create jobs, and to make the most of the opportunities that we know this terrible recession has brought about for our community. It's about action. It's about doing things, rolling up your sleeves, getting things done, delivering on your promises. But we know when it comes to delivering promises, the only thing that the Morrison government is fast-tracking at the moment is announcements. They have no plan to deliver on these announcements. We know they've made many announcements before the election, when they were asking the Australian people for their vote. And yet those announcements, even in a recession, remain undelivered. The Morrison government has their priorities wrong, and we know that they have underspent so far on housing, on nation-building infrastructure. They've spent plenty of money on advertising what their slogans are and putting up signs in shopping centres and on bus stops to tell the Australian public that there's an economic comeback on the way. But when you strip away the advertising and the slogans and the marketing, what we know we have is a very deep recession, a huge amount of debt, record deficits. But we need to know what we'll have to show for it after all this is done. How will this government build our nation back? At the moment, this budget, this document, does not show the way forward for the Australian people. This government has presided over record unemployment with 1 million unemployed, and it's forecast to remain unacceptably high for unacceptably long. Young people particularly have been hit hard by this crisis. The government's hiring credit subsidies are not enough to support the secure and permanent jobs that they need in the future. The hiring credit scheme hurts the 928,000 Australians over 35 who have been excluded from the program. The Morrison government has formed with failed policies when it comes to targeting youth unemployment. We know that programs like the PATH program, which was so ineffectively, was quietly cut. 678 elder Australians have died in aged care during the coronavirus pandemic. But this budget doesn't include measures that are needed to make sure that there are enough workers on site, enough PPE, and the measures that we need to make sure that it never happens again. But I'm really pleased to have an opportunity to talk about this budget, particularly speaking ahead of the minister, because it means that I'll be able to bring to the attention of the Senate and those opposite the one thing in the budget papers that I was really looking for on budget night. And I know that as the budget papers get dropped off around this place and people open them up and they're scanning through to try to find where are the jobs going to be, where are the promises, how will we overcome these issues, was one particular forward payment that I was looking for. As a Queenslander and a senator based in Cairns, housing is one of the biggest issues for people living in far north Queensland. It is one of the biggest issues that is holding back economic development. that is holding back the health and well-being of people living in Queensland. So when I looked to find what the remote housing funding commitment was from this government for the many years to come, you wouldn't be surprised to find out. As you flip through the pages, page 43 of the Federal Financial Relations Budget Paper number 3, remote housing in Queensland for the next financial year and the one after that and the one after that, there is nothing. There is nothing in this budget, a recession budget, when we need to rebuild, when we need to create jobs. There is nothing in this budget that will make sure that we deal with the remote housing issue in far north Queensland. And can I tell you that I have stood here many times since becoming a senator, having the opportunity to travel through Cape York and the Torres Strait and to see the very desperate need for social housing, for remote housing. I've stood up here and I've gotten angry about it. And I've decided to not get angry tonight, but just explain to the Senate, to the Minister, and to the people sitting opposite, the members of the government, why we need this fixed now. COVID was an opportunity for this government to understand how important it is for people to have a house. You can't isolate from coronavirus if you don't have a house. You can't isolate from coronavirus if you're living in a house with 28 to 30 people. But in our country, in the state of Queensland, under this government, that is exactly the situation that we face. And we were desperately concerned when there were outbreaks across the country, knowing the full situation about overcrowding in housing, that if a case of coronavirus were to make it its way to the far north Queensland and to the Cape York or Torres Strait, it would be incredibly difficult to isolate any single individual or family. I've visited places like Yarrabah. I've visited places like Arakoon. I've been to the Torres Strait, all over the islands there. I have visited places in Cairns that desperately need social housing. We need remote housing now. What did the government do in the budget? Well, they didn't deliver any reoccurring ongoing funding. And what that means for people living in far north Queensland is that the government went around before the election and asked for their vote. And they told them that they would deliver $100 million of remote housing to councils directly. They said, we will fund $100 million of remote housing. They didn't say to them at the time that they weren't going to continue to fund remote housing, but now we know that that money is a one-off. It's a one-off, and when it's gone, there'll be nothing more. So what has happened now through this budget is they have decided that now is the time, during an economic recession, during a COVID-19 economic health crisis and recession, that now is the time that they should wash their hands of Indigenous communities in far north Queensland that need houses to survive. The money that they promised before the last election, $105 million, well, do you know how much money they've actually delivered to communities in far north Queensland? None of that. $5 million of that money has been transferred to the state. We are still waiting on $100 million. And sure, it appears on a line and small font on a piece of paper in the budget. But when you actually find out what this government has done when it comes to remote housing, after all the promises before the last election, after they went around, stood up in Cape York and told people that they would deliver housing for far north Queensland, for the Cape, for our First Nations people, they told them that and they said, vote for us because we will deliver housing for you. Well, they haven't delivered a single cent of that money. They haven't delivered a single cent of that money. Not a single house has been built after that promise over 12 months ago, and during the budget, when the government had the chance to deliver ongoing, reoccurring funding to make sure that for many generations we were able to make sure that people have housing, that kids are not growing up in a house with 29 other people. Well, what did they do? They washed their hands of this problem. They said, no, leave it to the states. It's got nothing to do with us. How many times have they said that during this crisis? It's a matter for the states. It's a matter for the states. It's a matter for the states. Isn't it depressing when you've got a federal government that would rather leave important infrastructure decisions, funding for people to survive in housing, to somebody else? You know what real leaders do? They stand up and they say, I'm going to make a difference on this. I'm going to fix this problem. I have the will, the power, the resources. I'm going to do something to fix this. But this government just walks away. That's what they've done to people living in far north Queensland. So the Minister tonight will give a speech about this budget, about the appropriations that are in this budget, and he'll talk a lot about the things that the government has done during this coronavirus outbreak. And there'll be lots of discussion about jobs, but one of the easiest and quickest ways that you could create jobs in Queensland would be to fund remote housing and social housing for people who really need it. Those construction jobs, those jobs that could be created right now. And it's not an issue just for Indigenous councils. Can I tell you that all over regional Queensland, the areas that this government say that they support, that they represent, that they go out there and tell people that we stand up for people in regional Queensland, well, you don't. Because what they are saying right now is that they need housing. Mount Isa needs housing, Stanthorpe needs housing. There is nowhere for people to live. And yet the Deputy Prime Minister gets up all the time and talks about this idea of regionalisation, that people should go live in the regions, pick up your bags and go and live in the regional Queensland. Well, I would encourage people to do that as well. But when they get there, there's a housing shortage. And yet this was the opportunity. This was the opportunity. This was the document. This was the chance for this government and the members opposite who say that they stand up for the regions, who say that they stand up for people living in the bush, to do something about the housing situation that we have in Queensland and all across the country, I would imagine. But instead of doing anything, this government shirked off responsibility, left pages blank in the budget papers. What a terrible indictment on this government, that they'll say speeches about how fantastic states have done, pat themselves on the back for the work of other people, but not deliver something as crucial as a house for people to live in. I can't imagine what it would be like to be a parent making a decision to raise a child in a house with 28 other people, knowing that your government promised to deliver housing, but walked away at the very first opportunity to do it. You know, at the end of this recession, at the end of this election term, Australians really will be wondering, what is the plan? Is the plan to use taxpayers' money to put nice advertising in shopping centres and bus stops, when the plan really could be to deliver the things that our community needs right now? Not in 3 or 4 years, not 10 years down the track, but right now. People living in far north Queensland need houses. This government promised to deliver it. When they got the chance in the budget, they walked away from it. And that is a terrible indictment on this government. They don't care about people. They're leaving them behind. And it is a shameful, shameful thing to do to a group of people who believe that this government would do the right thing when given the chance. Thank you.